Hello everybody and welcome to part 12 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues and we start in orbit with our space station, the Aristotle, because we've got a little bit of housekeeping to get out of the way just before we get to the main event, or I should say events, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. All the fast forwarding we did at the end of the last episode has meant that our science lab has had a chance to fill itself right up with science, ready to transmit back to Kerbin. And I do mean right up. It's 500 out of 500. I probably should have checked on it a little bit earlier, but we haven't lost much science in that process, not in the greater scheme of things, so no real harm done. So we start transmitting that chunk of science back to Kerbin, and I don't think this is going to be enough to get ourselves anything new on the tech tree, but then again, there's nothing I really need at the moment. We're not going to start any grand endeavours before our craft have returned from Eve and Juno respectively, and I have all the tech I need to be going on with in the meantime. Anyway, with that science transmitted, our cache is empty, ready for Gwenby Kerman to start filling it back up again. I'm not going to replenish the science data in the lab just yet. I'm going to let it run down a bit further so we can chuck in one of the larger experiments from the experiment storage container, much as I did a little while ago. And now, with our administrative tasks out of the way, it's time to take ourselves elsewhere, to get into something a little bit more involved, and this is where things get a little complicated. So it all starts simply enough as we join our nuclear-powered probe as it is rapidly approaching Joule. We're already within Joule's sphere of influence, we're just waiting as our craft makes its way down towards Periapsis. You can just about see Joule in the background there as a tiny green dot. If it's any help, then the tail end of the craft is kind of pointing towards it. Now, this is another gravity probe similar to the one we sent to Moho. It has a little science package on the front, and that contains 16 negative gravioli detectors for us to take various readings in and around Joule and its moons. Now, I haven't given this probe a name yet. I had originally intended to give it a name once we lost that large booster section, but as this mission goes on, it becomes apparent that's not going to happen within a suitable time frame, so I go ahead and give it a name anyway, but we've got a little bit of stuff to get out of the way before we get to that point. So we follow our probe as it descends towards Joule and its many moons. We've got a periapsis at the moment of roughly 19 million metres, which is a good place to start. It's just inside the orbit of Joule's closest moon, and as we get close, it's time to plan our next step. We start planning our orbital insertion burn, which originally was going to be a circularization burn as well, but as we're planning, I notice we get a good encounter with Tylo. Now, Joule doesn't have any biomes, so we can only get a maximum of 2 readings from that, so I decide I'll take the encounter, we can go get a bunch more readings, and we haven't expended too much fuel, or at least not as much as if we just circularized and then manoeuvred from there. I spend a little while fine-tuning the encounter, also with an eye on what happens after we leave Tylo, and to this end I also throw in a little bit of a plane correction just to make sure our orbit isn't messed up for future encounters. So with Joule now looming large and green in the background, we begin our burn. Now this is about a 5-minute burn, a little under 1200 metres per second, which is a little over a quarter of what we've got left in that booster stage, and with the science we'll get from Tylo, that means we are well within our Delta V budget at this point. Anyway, with that burn complete, we are on our way to Joule's third moon, but we're going to leave our probe to it, because right about now, we've got to be somewhere else. So from Joule to Juno, we join our original interplanetary craft, the Ptolemy, on its return mission to Juno, this time, of course, taking more of an interest in its moon Ike. Once we arrive at Juno's only moon, we will of course be doing our usual bunch of science experiments, as well as, fingers crossed, doing 2 missions down to the surface, but first we've got to get there. Things have gone well so far for Kerdard, Bargel, Johnny and Donfort Kerman, and we're still several days away from our encounter, but this is the perfect opportunity just to check in, see if we need to perform a course correction manoeuvre before we get too close and the Delta V requirements increase. Checking on the map view, it seems that a correction manoeuvre is indeed in order. In fact, we're coming in on what looks like a polar orbit of Juno, which would be quite good if we were actually getting science from Juno, but we're not. We're just going to Juno and then manoeuvring onwards to Ike. So with that in mind, the current state of affairs is far from ideal. So we plan our manoeuvre. It's not going to take much, only 7.5 metres per second of Delta V. As Juno is coming up from behind us, we need to make sure our periapsis is on the inside of Juno with respect to its orbit around Kerbal, just to make sure we're going the right way around Juno when we finally arrive. With our manoeuvre planned, we turn the Ptolemy to face the manoeuvre node. It's big and heavy and it takes a while, but we do get there. And for this one, I'm going to use monopropellant. We've got loads to spare. We're only doing 7.5 meters per second of delta V, so I thought we'd just save our regular fuel for this one. With our manoeuvre complete, we once again turn this heavy, lumbering craft, this time to face the prograde direction, and once we get our encounter with Juno, that will mean we are facing roughly retrograde, which is kind of where we want it. But that encounter will not be for another 9 days or so. We don't have the luxury of just having 9 days to hang around, however. Our probe's Tylo encounter is in roughly 5, so we need to start preparing for that. At this stage, we just need to make some fine adjustments to our rendezvous, so I use the manoeuvre node to start with, just to make sure I'm going to burn in the correct direction. Then I'm just going to do it by burning with the craft pointing the right way, and just keeping an eye on the our encounter periapsis. I've already decided that this encounter is just going to be a simple flyby, so I want to get our periapsis nice and low, which will give us the opportunity to take readings both from in-space high and in-space low over Tylo. Once we're finished with that flyby, I'm going to try manoeuvre it so I can take a reading from in-space low over Joule. I've already taken a reading from in-space high, and from then on out, I think I'm just going to play it by ear, see what opportunities for encounters crop up. With our periapsis set as low as I dare, it's time for us to follow our probe on its journey round the giant green planet, until before too long it arrives within Tylo's sphere of influence. Immediately we take our first reading from in-space high over Tylo's lowlands, and from there on in it's a pretty familiar routine. We time accelerate forward until we encounter a new biome, drop out of time acceleration, take a reading, then rinse and repeat. Because of our path over Tylo, we initially only encounter the 3 basic biomes, the highlands, the midlands and the lowlands, so we get a set of readings from in-space high and then proceed to repeat the process whilst we're in space low. Just as we get into the tail end of our flyby, we do pick up the Grissom crater whilst we're in space low. We don't get an opportunity to take a reading above that whilst we're in space high, so with our flypass complete, we now have 8 of a potential 16 readings. So with that all done, and with Tylo's sphere of influence behind us, we head on up to our apoapsis over Joule, and from here we're going to get ourselves pointing retrograde and burn our periapsis down below the relevant 4 million metre mark. Our probe is about 2.5 days away from its periapsis, so we've just got time to switch to the Ptolemy and follow that in until it gains its encounter in roughly 2 days' time. Just as I'm about to time accelerate, however, I notice that our delta V readout is very, very low. We seem to have lost 97% of our delta V without actually doing anything. I quickly tracked down the problem though. It turns out the nuclear engines, for some bizarre reason, had decided to switch themselves to using monopropellant. So I switched them back to liquid fuel. It's a good thing we didn't burn with it like that, because we'd have gone through all our monopropellant in seconds. But with that problem out of the way, we can finally follow the Ptolemy to its encounter with Juno, and we're just going to stick with the Ptolemy for a second. We're just going to plan our orbital insertion burn. For the burn itself, I was kind of in 2 minds. I mean, do we just circularize and then go to Ike from there, or do we leave the apoapsis hanging up a bit and then use some aerobraking to bring that down and save some fuel? In the end, I decided I'm just going to do an orbital insertion burn of 300 meters per second. That leaves both options pretty much open for me, and we'll decide a little bit later on. So we've planned our burn, but we're not going to be performing it just yet. We need to switch back to our probe, which is only about 1.5 hours away from its periapsis around Joule. By this point, I've kind of realised that we're not going to lose that booster stage anytime soon, so we need to get on with naming this probe. So I decided to call it Juno, after the consort of the god Jupiter, sort of in keeping with the naming convention that I started with the Larunda. So the newly christened Juno heads down towards its periapsis over Joule. As soon as we cross the 4,000 kilometre mark, the threshold between in-space high and in-space low, we take another reading, and now we've got to work out what we do with this thing next. We're on roughly a 5-day orbit, and we're not going to pick up any new encounters between now and 1 orbit's time, at least not without manoeuvring, so I decide to just let the Juno do 1 complete orbit, and we'll pick it up from there. So we've got 5 days to kill, and I think you know what that means. Yes, we switch back to the Ptolemy, where the engines have switched back to using monopropellant. We fast forward through most of the 2.5-day journey down to Periapsis, we switch our engines back to liquid fuel and hope they stay there, and now we can perform our burn. Now, with all the engine troubles, our burn time indicator is shot to hell, so I have to guess at when to start the burn. I think it ended up being about a 3-minute burn, and with that performed, we are captured in orbit around Juno, with about 3 days to go until we're at Apoapsis and have to decide what we're going to do next. So, back we go then. The Juno has just passed its apoapsis by the time we return to it, and we're just going to follow it down to periapsis, and then we're going to do some planning, because we want to get those last 7 readings to fill up that science package. From here I decide I'm just going to try planning a manoeuvre at our next apoapsis, so I try burning prograde to see if we can pick up an encounter with either Lathe or Val, and almost immediately an encounter with Lathe appears. We do some fine-tuning on the manoeuvre. We're not going for a low periapsis this time for reasons that will become apparent a little bit later. No, we just want to get our periapsis down to roughly 250,000 metres and leave it there for the time being. So with that manoeuvre planned, we have 2.5 days until we reach our manoeuvre node. 2.5 days until we have to make that burn and gain our encounter with Lathe. But we're not going back to the Ptolemy this time. I'm just kidding. Of course we're going back to the Ptolemy. Back around Juno then, and the Ptolemy is approaching its apoapsis, and our manoeuvre to get to Lathe has sort of made me realise something. You see, we don't need to circularise around Juno. Juno is not our destination, Ike is. We can probably burn from here or hereabouts, get an encounter, and probably use less delta V in the process. On map view, and with Ike selected as our target, we already have a pair of closest approach markers, so I add a manoeuvre at our apoapsis, I add a bit of prograde velocity, and hey presto, we almost instantly get an encounter with Ike. So we fine-tune our manoeuvre a little bit. Once again, we want to get a periapsis of about 250,000 metres. I throw in a bit of a plane correction again, and then we are set. Oh, and the engines have switched back to using monopropellant again. So we get our craft pointing in the correct direction, we time accelerate to close to the manoeuvre node, and we switch those engines over to using the correct propellant, ready to perform what I think is possibly the shortest burn I've ever made with these engines. It's 11 seconds, and you're watching this at 4 times speed, so there you go, bang, done. With that manoeuvre complete, the Ptolemy is on its way to its final destination of Ike, and it'll arrive at the encounter in about 3 days' time, so you know what that means, don't you? So the final pieces of the puzzle are nearly in place as we return to the Juno, and the fuel in that booster stage really has lasted a lot longer than I had initially planned. The original plan was that we'd perform our orbital insertion and circularization burn around Joule, and then most of the fuel in the booster stage would be spent. We'd detach the probe, that would go off exploring the Joule system, whilst we took the autonomous booster stage and deorbited that down to a fiery death in the atmosphere of Joule, but yeah, it's lasted a lot longer than I thought it would. But anyway, on with the task at hand. First of all, we need to time accelerate forward a little under 2 days to get this probe up to its apoapsis where our manoeuvre will take place. Having made sure that the craft is pointing the correct way and that our engines are on, it's time for us to make our burn, 1 minute and 22 seconds of it to be precise. Well, not quite as it turns out. You see, I hadn't set the manoeuvre up exactly as I wanted it to, so I decided what I'd do is I'd perform the bulk of the burn, and then I'd throttle the engines right down, switch to map view, and I'd fine-tune it from there, make sure we got exactly the periapsis we wanted. I do make a slight mistake here. Just as we're about to finish the burn, I accidentally hit the wrong key and go to full throttle instead of no throttle, so we overshoot a little bit. I have to turn the craft around, burn in the retrograde direction, but eventually we do get a nice encounter set up. With all our manoeuvring with the Juno completed, for the time being at least, we shut down the engine because it does make a fair bit of noise, even when it's idle. And there we are off on our journey to Lathe, which we will encounter in a little under 3 days' time. So for one final time this episode, we switch back to the Ptolemy. Also for one final time this episode, the main engines have once again switched over to monopropellant. I have no idea what's causing that. This is the first time I've encountered anything like that, but anyway. We time accelerate our journey around Juno, and it's not too long before we arrive within Ike's sphere of influence. We plan our circularization burn, not much to write home about here, very simple, not much to go wrong, and indeed, nothing does go wrong. We switch our engines over to the correct propellant. This time the burn time indicator does start working again. We get our craft pointing in the right direction, and then we time accelerate down to our periapsis. With the engines activated, the burn time indicator reads 1 minute and 29 seconds, so we await for the allotted moment, and then we fire up those 3 Lantern nuclear engines. With our burn complete, we've managed to attain a nice circular orbit, and now it's time to say farewell to the Ptolemy and its brave crew for one final time this episode, because we've got one more thing we need to do before we're finished for today. So we return to the Juno, which hasn't gone very far from where we last left it, but we'll soon sort that. We time accelerate until we get our encounter, and then we can get our first look at Lade, the dark blue ocean moon, contrasting against its bright green parent planet. Our first order of business, once again, is to plan our orbital insertion and circularization manoeuvre, leaving us with an altitude of around about 250,000 metres as planned. We follow the Juno down to periapsis, and then we fire up that single nuclear engine for what turns out to be about a 3-minute burn. Now, not long before we started this manoeuvre, we lost our direct line of communication to the KSC, which means we've got limited control over this probe for this manoeuvre. It's not too much hassle, but because these nuclear engines don't tend to throttle to zero instantly, what I like to do normally on these manoeuvres is just throttle the engine down, taper the thrust off towards the end of the manoeuvre, but with the limited control we can't do that. The throttle's either full open or full closed. I do find a way around it. It's basically just turning the engines on and off really quickly. And then we are set in our orbit around Lade. It's a little bit more eccentric than I'd like, but well, we'll sort that out a little bit later. In the meantime, though, it's time for us to start harvesting the science that we came for. We have 4 instruments left to take readings in space high above Lade, and 3 to take readings in space low. During our high pass, we take readings from the Sagan Sea, the DeGrasse Sea, nice references there by the way, and also the shallows and the shores. With our first sweep complete then, it's time for us to lower our orbit and get our second set of readings. For this I use my usual trick of trying to burn in line with the day-night terminator. It tends to mean that you have line of sight to Kerbin, and it works well in this case. And with our orbit lowered, we grab the last of the science to fill up that science package, thanks to readings from the DeGrasse Sea, the Sagan Sea, and the shallows. And with that completed, we are done for today. The Juno is just parked there, ready for us to begin our manoeuvres to take it back to Kerbin. The Ptolemy, of course, will have to remain around Ike because it still has to do its thing, but we'll get on to that in the near future. I hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. It's been an interesting one to play through and edit, I'll give it that much. But for now, thanks for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.